just as it has always been, when our memories of the ancient world fade into twilight, a new era dawns to fill the void, an unfamiliar path with a pulse of its own, a tempo not dictated by the labor of men, but accelerated by the rhythm of machines, launching the world into an age of bold innovation. From this cauldron of steel and sweat, a vision of prosperity emerged. Harnessing the untold power of the elements, turning night into day. Creating new designs that brought the world stage to the masses. And providing an experience that many had never imagined. The advent of mechanized warfare brought devastation like none the world had ever seen. Providing a window of opportunity for some to dictate conformity as regimes spread their ideologies with a heavy hand. Inciting the world to the brink of war. And yet, some chose a different path, and through their vision brought unique perspectives to the world. As singular proponents of free thinking remained, striving for peace in their endeavors to unlock the secrets of the universe, some of which would fill our hearts with fear and regret. And as this progress unfolds, the finite nature of our world becomes clear. Our survival, the survival of all the world's peoples, depends on our ability to coexist in peace. But this peace is tenuous. Although mankind will always look onward, yearning for more, searching for new boundaries, only to break through them, with the understanding that this world is one in which we all share, comes the responsibility of knowing that the decisions you make today will have a lasting impact on the generations of tomorrow.
Good evening, everyone. This is System Chuck. Thanks a lot for stopping by on another Friday, and during your holidays, no less. Tonight we've got another special. This is going to be part of the ongoing Extra Life fundraising efforts. The 24-hour broadcast has long since passed. It's up on the YouTube site, but we are very close to raising $500, and a few professors from UBC agreed to stop by the stream and share some insights that they have on areas of their specialty while we play Civilization and potentially other games depending on what the professors are. So this one was a little bit unique where Professor Marshall did agree to speak to me, but the only time that we could work out would be in the morning. And so what I did for this one was I did a recorded interview with him, which I'll be playing back to you. So if it sounds a little bit odd, I fairly frequently refer to the fact that this is recorded during the interview. And so my failings as an interviewer hopefully will not affect the experience for you guys. But I'll just silently play Civilization in the background while you guys get a chance to hear it. And a special thank you to my brother David for doing an audio check for me. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin the interview right when he introduces himself, and I'll just let the thing run continuously. Give me a second here to set up the appropriate links for Extra Life, give people a chance to come into the lobby, and we'll take it from there. And one feature of Civilization running in windowed mode is the music goes away when I put it up, so this will be out for a second. Sorry for the dead air on this one. There, maybe as a technical background for those who are interested. This broadcasting software is OBS. It's fantastic for the fact that it is free and it gives, there we go. It gives you, and basically it gives me a platform to stream, but the Mac version of this client is fairly new. And so a consequence of that is sometimes when I want to do something like add in a text such as the extra life, um, it doesn't always respond right away, and so that requires me to go out into another menu, which means that we go without audio. So again, it's a thing that I'd like to get a little bit better at in terms of doing seamless transitions, but in the end, I think as an introduction for all of this, Professor Marshall has some really interesting ideas in terms of narrative and what that means, especially when you play a game which has a set of rules or things like that, how that affects the experience. I mean, I really should let him um, communicate those ideas because I certainly couldn't do them justice by summarizing the interview on its own. So looks like we've got a few people filing in, and we will set up our civilization before playing back the interview. All right, that's the last moment of silence for a little. Actually, sorry, there'll be one more while I adjust the volume for the interview. But other than that, actually, I can do that here. And I'm going to take a minute to review my achievements, and let's see if we can get something new unlocked while we're doing this. So I'm past King. I think I need to do a large of the regular planet. Let's try Washington this time around. I haven't played the United States. I suppose it would be nice to do the ancient Greeks, seeing as we did Rome last time, but let's change it up a bit. All right. After the introduction for Washington, we will take the interview in progress.
American civilization. Formed in the conflagration of revolution in the 18th century, within 100 years the young nation became embroiled in a terrible civil war that nearly tore the country apart. But it was just a few short years later, in the 20th century, that the United States reached the height of its power, emerging triumphant and mighty from the two terrible wars that destroyed so many other great nations. The United States is a nation of immigrants, filled with optimism and determination. They lack only a leader to help them fulfill their promise. President Washington, can you lead the American people to greatness? Can you build a civilization that will stand the test of time?
And this interview will begin just after I asked him to introduce himself and what he does at UBC. I hope you guys enjoy this.
Sure. My name is Toph Marshall. I'm a professor in the Department of Classical Near Eastern Religious Studies. There's a couple of strands to my research. A lot of it has had to do with how ancient Greek and Roman theater were performed in antiquity. asking those questions have led to general questions about how audiences respond to texts, and particularly to fiction. And so that's extrapolated into modern media as well. So I've written on television and movies and comic books. And associated with that, I've taught classics and pop culture from time to time.
Okay, excellent. And actually, when your name had come up, I actually took a little bit of a look on your website and all of that. It was something that I'd never really thought of in terms of what a field of research was, but it was absolutely fascinating when I first saw it. So um, maybe just to extend that introduction a little bit, how did you get started in something like that? Because it sort of seems like the project that everybody would dream of doing, but it seems really hard to sort of propose.
Well, certainly, the study of the reception of classics in the modern world is something that's been going on for most of the 20th century. It's under the rubric of the classical tradition. Um, and generally it looks at elite art forms, poetry, opera, things like that, in order to celebrate how classical learning has, improved the moral fiber of British society, let's say. I resist that class-based reading, and the popular media that I consume tend to be, I'll say, traditionally low genres like comic books and television, but I think it's important to be proud of that. Um, I'm active in theater, so I'm familiar with some higher media, but I like pop culture. I think pop culture does really exciting and interesting things, and it's what I choose to consume in my off hours. And so, looking at the role of Greek and Roman culture in shaping that has given me one body of research. So I've done um, some books on classics and comics, for example. But the questions that I'm asking about how ancient narratives were consumed by their audiences, what an audience thought when they looked at the stage, for example, should be questions that are relevant across cultures and across class divisions. And so I've done some work thinking about how television communicates effectively to people today, and asking those questions allows me to have some feedback into maybe new avenues of approach for understanding the ancient world where the evidence is so fragmentary.
Okay. Um, so actually, this sort of gives me two different areas in which we can sort of examine um, this question ourselves. Obviously, the background of this kind of a show would be usually just a website that's dedicated to playing a video game. And I think the nicest thing that happened as a result of the Extra Life fundraiser, which is sort of what this series is sort of about, um, was that people were very interested in a lot of the ideas about Greek and Roman culture, specifically in terms of the game that I was playing. And they wanted to engage in it in a little bit of a deeper way. So I think there's two things that we can talk about. There's either a um, very modern thing like Civilization, which is a game, probably one of those low cultures. But I think people would also be very interested in hearing about, you know, how people actually received theater, in its original form. Could we maybe start with that?
I'll signal a couple of things that we might want to touch on as well, though, because the way that games create narrative, I think, is also a really exciting subject, and it's something that hasn't been fully thought through in my experience. But modern gaming tells different types of stories
Okay.
than any other media that we've had, and I think that's actually one of the really exciting things that gaming offers to us. So, as long as we can come back to that eventually.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to cover that topic, especially because it's something I know it's something that the audience has communicated and interested in the past. So,
Good. So, when I look at ancient theater, I'm asking questions about what actors did, how stagecraft, how masks work, how roles got shared, what the chorus did, how dance and music work. Very practical, down-to-earth questions that we really don't have good answers for. And it's my assumption that, or my premise, I guess, that the plays were intended to be consumed as live events in the first instance. Sure, some people were reading the texts afterwards, and sure, that's what we tend to do today. But the play had to make sense in the first instance as a live performance, um, and only secondarily is reading the text when you don't have actors, you don't have mimetic voices, you don't have choruses dancing. Um, and so one of the questions that we could go to is, what is the function of masks, for example? And people have talked about how, people have speculated without ever actually holding a mask that maybe it had a megaphone effect in order to magnify your voice. Experiments actually show that it tends to deaden the voice, and makes it harder vocally. And so what does that mean? Well, one of the things that I think masks did is they gave a very clear and iconic face that was able to be seen over a great distance. In a world before corrective lenses, I might only see slightly blurry things, assuming I make it to adulthood and not get eaten by bears. And so if I'm going to the play, I need to be able to identify characters. And so my understanding of masks is that they tend to be simple, iconic faces, identifying basically rough age categories, what generation you're in, whether you're old or mature or young, whether if you're a male figure, you've got white hair and a beard, dark hair and a beard, or dark hair and no beard. But that's the visual evidence that's coming across, and the color of your skin. It'll be slightly darker if you're a male, because you're presumed to work out in the sun. And so you can tell young men from young women from their costume, but also from that iconic aspect of the mask. But really nothing, I believe nothing essential is being presented to an audience beyond that in terms of the face. But I think that's the crucial minimum that we need to be able to appreciate when we look at a character. If we wanted to jump ahead to cinema and television, where close-ups are now, valuable. They're tools that the camera people use in order to convey aspects of emotion and things like that. Masked acting is no longer necessary. An actor can look suspiciously over their glasses, and that reads meaningfully in a way that it wouldn't look, in a way that it wouldn't read in antiquity. If you look at early films, when they were still developing a language, it was assumed that you needed to have the full body. So you see these things with people's heads way up here, and it looks stilted. And it's only in the 30s when you start to get close-ups being used more and more regularly that you lose that very stilted sense of needing to have the full body in the figure. It would be, your viewers probably wouldn't appreciate it if I were way back here in order so that they could see more of me. It would mean less, and it would. So the relationship of the performer to the medium, I guess, is ultimately the question that I've got, and seeing it as a performance medium. If we again jump ahead to video games, first-person shooters feel different than games where you're tracking behind the head of your little dude running around, or a game like Civilization where you've got this godlike top-down approach, which leads to games like Godlike. It's even in the name, because that's you're manipulating these people with a carefree abandon, willing to sacrifice generations and generations of young men in order to conquer a city, irrespective of the feelings of the individuals. So our attachment to those characters is a lot less than when we're tracking the back of Lara Croft's head.
That's actually a really interesting point that you make too. One of the things about Civilization that sort of interested me when I compare it to my own background, which would be in economics, was I thought it's a fine little example of, let's say, the social planner, where you kind of have this great control over everything like that. But the idea of revolution in the game really only ever comes up, if your happiness level becomes, so low. But if you want to go from, let's say, democracy to totalitarianism or nothing like that, you don't need to work for it. You just hit a button and then you go in, and that's just the way that the world works. So I mean, that's a fine little segue into some of the ideas of modern, a modern format like gaming. And you talked a little bit about the difference of how the narrative is shaped, one by perspective, but I'm assuming you probably have a bit more to say than just on perspective.
Well, sure. There's early video games, had that iterability, the sense of being able to play them over and over again. New lives, three new lives cost a quarter back in the days when people plug quarters into machines in submarine sandwich shops in order to play whatever game they were doing. There was the sense of going through the same routines. You learned how to navigate Pac-Man through a maze, but once you had a pattern that you knew worked, you stuck with that pattern because that was the only way to get to the next level. And the same is true of Donkey Kong and various other of the early games. I think that's true to a smaller extent now, that a lot of online flash games, for example, still have that very simple iterability. If you think of tower defense games, for example, where you're you learn ideal locations to place your towers. You repeat, you go through the same motions time and again, and variation. Once you've had success, variation stops being interesting, or is less interesting. Now that's different than an MMO. You still need to, with different characters, you've got slightly different experiences. Your sense of leveling a character up, or my sense of leveling a character up in those early grinding levels is still different when you're it can be differentiated, let's say. But if we start by thinking about a tower defense game, for example, we can see that there's no advantage in experimentation unless you're just going to play and just try and pop all the balloons or whatever it is you're doing with one particular type of weapon for a laugh when you know you're choosing a suboptimal strategy. Sometimes those stories are abstract, and sometimes they're given a narrative form. Orc hordes are coming against your tower defenses, and you've got to stop them. There's actually one that is sort of a side-scrolling tower defense game where the Greeks are attacking the city of Troy, and you put your missile cannons on the walls of Troy. You send out troops to combat the attacking Greeks. And there's some interesting things in that, interesting for me at least, because when you're playing the Trojans, eventually you're going to lose. You can postpone the eventual Greek conquest, but there's always going to be more and more waves of Greeks coming from the far side of the screen. And so the narrative of the Trojan War and the inevitable Trojan defeat is written into the game. Now I can stop their big, the on the boss levels or whatever. I can pretend that it's Ajax, or I can pretend that it's Agamemnon. Yeah. But even if I can get past that one level, there's still going to be more and more waves coming at me, so that eventually Troy does fall. And I've never been able to make a game last more than, well, I haven't been able to make it last 10 years, let's say. I sort of top out at half an hour. Yeah. But it still is creating a sense of the Trojan War narrative.
Yeah.
And I think there's actually something sort of cool and something sophisticated in choosing that. That's different than if I were playing the Greeks, where, again, if it were reversed, the Trojans did, it's not the narrative of Homer that's being replicated. and it would be less interesting for me. So I can, tell myself that I'm sending out Hector, I'm sending out, one of the names I know from Greek epic. No, not everyone needs to do that. Others can just play the mindless tower defense game. But the fact that there's a narrative built in, I think is sort of interesting. And the narrative in a game like Civilization, I'll say, is perhaps more problematic because it's purporting to give historical figures and historical experiences. And because it's a more sophisticated game, in order to maintain its interest, it needs to have more narrative variables. But in introducing those variables, I think that there's a lot that's perhaps lost. Sorry, do we want to go into this right away? Is this okay?
Yeah, no, let's. It's a very interesting topic.
All civilizations are notionally balanced against one another. You might prefer playing the Greeks or the Carthaginians rather than the Romans, but you've got an equal shot at getting to an industrialized point, regardless of what civilization you choose. So they've been historically leveled, and they've been curtailed, they've been economically curtailed, so that growth happens at a regular rate, regardless of what culture you're playing. So that actually erases a lot of cultural differences that might otherwise be interesting. If I play the Greeks, it's irrelevant whether I've developed poetry or whether I've got exciting plays going on or traditional oral bards. All that matters is if I upgrade my armor to bronze or from bronze to iron as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And I look at my hoplite and I wonder if maybe I should have had elephants. But that leveling process that notionally says that all cultures are going to make it and all are going to be sort of equalized, and equalized is problematic for my historical sense. But in addition to that, the fact that cultural value resides entirely in military accomplishment. That, sure, maybe if you harvest quicker or put more resources into, the farmers or whatever it is, but your reason for doing so is to get resources to build soldiers. And I'll say that's not a narrative that history has typically presented as viable. That the Roman legions were part of their success, but it's foolish to say that was the entirety of their success. And they themselves were a very belated culture coming on the scene, and you wouldn't want to start a game of Civilization with 3 of your rivals already at an advanced state when you're just trying to farm your stupid little village. And it would be a different, and I'll say a considerably less fun game. The need for player balance, for scenarios that have been tested and play tested, I think is an important one. But the gaming experience subordinates an awful lot of historically interesting questions. And so in telling narratives through this medium, we need to change a lot, and we need to accept that there's not going to be historical veracity. So, if I read a message board as one might do, and I see people complaining about the length of the Macedonian spears, I sort of roll my eyes that that's not where the lack of historicity lies. That there are pretty more fundamental questions that are really easy to overlook because we want fairness. We want to play a game that is roughly the same experience for everyone playing it, and we want it to be the same, regardless of what culture you choose. Even if you're choosing, something that we know didn't gain traction historically, didn't last more than a few centuries, we still want to be able to take them up and build nuclear bombs for them.
There's maybe actually two anecdotes that I'll share. The one thing I love is the idea of the when you mention nuclear bombs, one thing that I have to mention is there's a very famous sort of incident in terms of Gandhi in Civilization, which is he's always the fellow who nukes you. Now, the reason for this was that they had set his aggression level to the lowest, and apparently in the first civilization, when you adopt democracy, your aggression level will go lower. But in the first game, basically, this brought it so low that it reset the counter. They had like I think it was 256 bits or something like that. So then it would go to the highest level of aggression once Gandhi adopts democracy. And this is apparently the origin of the story that Gandhi always nukes you. And I mean they've sort of kept it in the sense that he has a higher propensity to launch missiles if he gets them. But he isn't maybe the warmonger that he was in the original game once he adopted democracy. So that's a little, again, just dovetailing a
That's
bit off
fun.
of the
Yeah.
nuclear one. But actually, the other anecdote I wanted to share, when you're talking about how problematic it is to have everybody start from the same level. I mean, from a gameplay standpoint, it makes perfect sense. You're actually articulating the very problems that I had with the Civilization board game, which I only played about 3 times, because that was truly a game where if you started off with 2 resources on a tile, you were in a great spot, but it was always randomly distributed. And so if you started off with, let's say, 1 resource or no resources, the game was a foregone conclusion, which, if I think back to maybe the Jared Diamond read or something like that, that speaks very true to me. I mean, it's obviously not just about resources and military conquest, but it definitely seems to be a better reflection of history, and I think a little bit of what you're talking about. Although I will tell you firsthand, as you say, it didn't make for the most compelling player experience. I figured at that point, once you've done the initial setup, you might as well just say, okay, well, Jessica wins this round. Although I'm not entirely sure Alexander or Augustus would have have said that if we're playing Greece and Rome.
Okay, well, I want to go back to the Civilization board game. I'm interested in board games as well,
Okay,
and tabletop games
sure.
of different sorts. But when you say the Civilization board game, I think you're talking about the new one. Is that correct?
Uh,
You're
uh,
not talking about the Avalon Hill game made in the 70s that
uh,
pre-existed, the 70s or the early 80s, that pre-existed Sid Meier's first video game.
that's right. That would be something that is a board game adaptation of Sid Meier's game.
He who
Yeah,
is
no. So there was a adaptation of Sid Meier's computer games, but
Okay.
before that there was the precursor, which you should play. It's amazing.
Okay.
Um, I try and force my colleagues in Near Eastern archaeology to play with me. I can only get it sort of like once a year because it takes forever to play because the old Avalon Hill games, well, they inevitably take forever, and it's a cruel game. Like it doesn't historically level civilizations. You might start playing the Romans, and it's really hard to get going. Um, if you play the Egyptians, you do really, really well in the early game, but inevitably there's revolution, and your culture gets, if not wiped out, hugely weakened by the time by the mid to late game. So it actually replicates the transition from the early Bronze Age into the late Iron Age fairly well. Um, and so, in that respect, it's not fun. That every time you play, but it's also a really good game because the randomness has been completely removed. Um, you warfare is conducted essentially by resources. So if you've got 4 dudes in one plot of land and somebody else has 2 dudes in a plot of land, you just keep alternating removing dudes until you've got what the land can support. And so if the land will support 3, you might end up with 2 of yours and 1 of the other guys, and you live peaceably in that space. And if you don't want to live peaceably, you just need to put in more armies, but you know that you're going to lose the same amount. So there's no randomness in it. It's all tactical, so it's really good for that. There's no dice rolls that are offsetting your game experience. You invest in various technologies. It does pay to build in the arts so that you can get to democracy and things like that, but also because the game taps out at uh, you know into the Iron Age. You don't have the anachronism of the Goths suddenly being, uh, having submarines floating around, which is all, and taking out the Chinese or something like that. But again, it's ridiculous that the balancing mechanism in the modern civilization video games requires those two cultures to be on the same scale and lets the Goths build a great wall first. There's this equal opportunity to wonders that again asks or removes any historical specificity of the inventions.
I think actually it's kind of interesting to hear about this original game as well. It's certainly one I'm going to have to look up because it seems like
It's 13 hours of misery for all but two people at the table. Like I can guarantee you, which is why I love playing it. Because no other game guarantees that consistent or pays back that consistently. But it's fun to play with the archaeologist, and it's always surprising the way that true historical realities start being are embedded in the rules, and I like that sort of rule design aspect. That's one of the interests that I have in tabletop games is trying to embed behaviors or embed results into the rules. But I cut you off. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Actually, I was going to say too, one thing that sort of seems to be an interesting contrast that's coming up. You gave this great example of the siege of Troy and just this idea of inevitability, and I'm probably inappropriately thinking in terms of Greek tragedy or something like that, but it's hard not to just because. Um, and then you've got something like Civilization, which seems to kind of want to make you a master of your own destiny, and maybe goes a little bit too far in that sense. And that, it's really cool to build the pyramids and all of that, but it doesn't, there isn't any indication in terms of why, Great Britain or the Celts or somebody like that should build, the pyramids other than you want those two workers or something like that. Um,
Or it gives you plus 15% in your
yeah,
product yield or whatever it is, which, yeah.
yeah. Now, I think this obviously isn't entirely related to let's say the ancient world, but it doesn't have to, it doesn't entirely have to be on classics or something like that. I think one thing that,
Because we haven't been so far.
yeah, well, yeah, well, I was gonna say too, like it was that was Michael was my connection, but I mean this is a gaming channel, and certainly I do more than play Civilization. It just happened to be. I think people the reason for this series just came from the fact that during the fundraiser, and of course, maybe this is a brief reminder to the audience listening once this is recording that donations will still be going until the end of December, and that the purpose of this is to solicit more donations from you all. As fun as this is to talk about, I get a chance to talk to professors about interesting things, but you know, I'll also do an introduction at the beginning, but I should maybe cut that bit out. But one of the, I guess maybe in terms of talking about narratives and maybe this idea of, consequences for actions or decisions and things like that. One thing that we've recently started playing on the channel is an example of Telltale Games, The Wolf Among Us. Now, are you familiar with any of the Telltale Games series or something like that?
I've only played one once, so
Okay.
I know the premise of these things, but I don't have deep thoughts on them.
Okay, fair enough. Because I was just going to say it seemed interesting that they give you this idea of of consequence for your actions, and certainly what character. I think I haven't played The Walking Dead that they have, but when I've seen other people play it, certainly who will be with you in the party by the end will still be there. But on the other hand, they have programmed this story, and you are eventually going to wind up to where they want it anyway. So it sort of seemed like something that might be relevant to your interests, but maybe it isn't. As you said, it maybe isn't something enough to extend on.
Yeah, no, well, I think um, maybe I can pull that into a discussion of MMOs because uh, there's the same sort of inevitability in the narrative there. Like, they give you a story, and once after 20 hours, it might take someone 20 hours, it might take them 24, but after a set amount of play, you eventually get, you liberate the village or whatever it is. You've done enough side quests and major quests that you get a story, and sometimes that story has an emotional effect, and you actually feel proud, or NPC thanks you for accomplishing something that took you a lot of time. You've invested in it, and you've invested it through your avatar there. But there is that sort of inevitability in the narrative that's going to be hit. I like that. I think that's interesting. That I can do all my side quests in any order. I can I can be perverse in my choice of weapons or whatever it is if I want to, but still, after 24 hours, I'm really going to be at the same point that I'd be regardless. One of the things that I'm charmed by in these online worlds, though, is when people choose to do things that aren't part of that narrative. That I know it doesn't, and I don't play enough of these things to know how consistent this is. But on Christmas Eve, characters can be through their World of Warcraft, and they'll come across carolers, and it's a bunch of people just typing Christmas Carol lyrics at the same time, so that you see popping up all the lyrics of Christmas carols. But I think that's beautiful. There's no reward in game for doing so, but there's a sense of shared community, and it's something artistic. It's a creative, artistic endeavor. There was a time, this was several years ago now, and there have been many more stories since then, but where there was a guild of pink-haired gnomes that all looked ridiculous, and I'm sure there's YouTube clips of this, but one day they just all got together. You could only join if you were a pink-haired gnome, but you were in this guild, and then one day they went for a jog, and so this rows and rows, this big huge mass of pink-haired gnomes running through the shared virtual world was an unusual sight. There was no benefit to it, and a lot of time collectively had been invested to create this guild and to put it together. But because there were so many of them, the game lagged. And so the parade was going by. Everybody else's experience slowed down, and they had to watch. And it was, again, this sort of beautiful artistic moment where an experience is being created that wasn't what the gamers or the designers intended, that had purely aesthetic qualities. Now, you might not have liked it, you might have been annoyed, but you also saw orcs trying to run around and chase them and be part of this experience. You see other characters who weren't in the guild trying to run along too, just because it was a cool moment. And I'll say I really like the use of these gaming spaces for artistic activity, for that, for trying to circumvent a narrative and create a new experience. I can give more examples, but that's one of the things that sort of catches my attention, and I like hearing stories about that because it shows that these are more than just games. That in terms of the socialization and the interaction that goes on, you can create new things that aren't expected, that aren't just challenges for yourself, but are actually giving an experience for the other people in the virtual world at the same time. And fundamentally, that's what art's for.
I actually really like that story. I think it brings to mind, I've not played it myself, but I think EVE Online makes this great claim that it's kind of created this vast sandbox and that all the experiences inside that game are made entirely from the players. But it almost seems like the pink-haired gnome example is sort of special and unique precisely because there was a boundary to kick against, as opposed to Eve, which is just sort of like, well, we don't want to program a story, we don't want to program anything but a bunch of physics and economies, and you guys can make the game. So um, I don't know. I think I've seen a video of the pink-haired gnome, but it has this great nobility to it now that you've brought it to mind.
Nobility is a nice word. I like that. Yeah.
Now, I'm quite conscious of trespassing on your time here, so if I can maybe just, I'll maybe wrap it up with two more questions if
You have two more questions. That'd be great.
Okay. I guess the first one would be in terms of, obviously we're not going to be able to get into anything close to what you can give us on this material. There seems to be just so much to cover. I guess the first question I would have is in terms of if somebody was sort of interested in following up on these questions and just thinking a little bit more in terms about the reception of either the media that we're consuming today, but also as we started off in the beginning, the idea of these masks and ancient drama and things like that. Do you have any resources or books that you could recommend to somebody who wants to do some work on their own account?
I should have prepared myself.
Oh, that's yeah.
Better for this.
We can save it for another time too.
There's an archaeologist in London called Andrew Gardner, Gardner, and he's written some on video games and on the historical narratives, and certainly that shaped what I was saying about the leveling of societies and civilization. So certainly I think it's worth going to his work. There was some interesting work by an economist that I'm going to be able to remember when I type his name into Google, just to ensure that I'm spelling it correctly. Yeah, Edward Castronova,
Okay.
Castronova, who a few years ago was talking about the economics of Azarath, but trying to look at these worlds as economic units and as an economist. So I think his first book might be called Virtual Worlds or something like that.
Okay.
But I'll say it's good when thinkers take their specialist knowledge and treat gaming worlds, and particularly virtual worlds, seriously. I think that there's some interesting things that are going on there, and it's too easily dismissed. It's too easy to say, well, it's play, as if play is somehow not something that is interesting in the human experience or is somehow not worthy of scholarly study. So my interest in narratives has taken me mainly to comic books and things like this, but obviously I've thought a little bit about what games do, how to encode rules. That I'm not a computer programmer, but in terms of how specific experiences get built by the underlying source code. We play chess on a board with an equal number of pieces, but not all games have an equal number of pieces. There's a Viking board game called Tafel, the table, where there's an unequal number of pawns on different sides, and the one with the fewer also has the king. And so there's all sorts of different reconstructions that you can find online for this Viking chess game. One of the things that strikes me is that every one of the sets of rules that I have come across, and I've not been able to do better, eventually means the king wins. Now maybe this is that no matter how dumb you are, you still can win. Now maybe that's okay. Maybe as a pastime it's appropriate, and if you're the host, you play king, and maybe this is saying something about guest-host relationships in medieval Iceland. And so I speculate on that possibility. But I would like it if there were a set of rules that were balanced. I've done some work looking at ancient Roman board games as well, and I've introduced a few tweaks to the Roman board game rules that I've seen that I think make it fairer. Is it completely fair? Not yet, but I think my proposals are marginally better than the other proposals that I've seen out on these things. And so I like thinking about that. But it's possible that with this Viking game, that it's a particular experience that's being crafted. Yes, of course, the king is going to survive. How long can you delay it? Um, and maybe it is just a tower defense game that ultimately the host is going to win. That's acceptable, and nobody questions that experience. But can you tease it out? Can you get interesting stories to emerge while you're doing it? Can you make him, pressure him into one corner of the board and then push him to the other side? And maybe there are some fun things that can be done with these, simple, what, deceptively simple tabletop games, but asking those sorts of questions. What is the experience for the players? What experience is being created? Is, I think, one of the things that fundamentally makes games interesting and worthy of study. So I'll say that's one of the directions that one of the ways in which I justify occasionally looking at video games and pretend that it's of scholarly interest. I'm I'm interested in representations of gender and sex as well. So I think, well, I know that in when it's female presenting avatars get treated differently than male presenting avatars. Male presenting avatars sell for more on the online. There's an interesting sex-based or gender-based differential in those MMO worlds, and I think that really needs exploring. Why are we willing to pay more for a dude, but we still might choose to self-present as a female avatar when there's no strength differences coded into the experience? Why does chivalry still exist? So I think that's interesting. I've not seen any research on this, but I'm interested in the experience of first-person shooters, which, in my experience, tend to be male protagonists. But when you're looking in something like Diablo or in Lara Croft or the Tomb Raider games, when you've got what do you call it when the camera's behind the head of
Third-person shooter.
Is it just third-person shooter?
Usually that's
what I
what they
want to
call
say,
it.
but you know what I'm trying to describe here.
Yeah.
I think female avatars are more likely to be established in that context, not in an MMO world where you're interacting with real people, but when you're just boogieing around slaying the forces of evil. I think it's acceptable, or more acceptable, to have a female avatar in a third-person perspective than in a first-person perspective. I don't know what that's about, but that's one of the things that seems to me to be true based on the limited observation that I've made.
Yeah, well, I just, I do spend a lot of time in first-person shooters, but honestly, the only game that I can think of that would have a female protagonist from a first-person perspective would be the Portal game by Valve Software, and it's noted precisely because it's one of the few examples with a female protagonist.
It'd be
I'll maybe,
interesting to know how its sales do,
yeah.
and if that shapes things, or if there are mods available to change that experience. That too is interesting. What do people choose to modify
Yeah.
when they can?
Oh yeah, actually, I was going to say I guess we never talked about modding, but I mean that must have a great relevance to what you're talking about in terms of creating.
Absolutely. Because
Yeah.
that's changing the shape of the narrative
Mhm.
and making it available for other people.
Absolutely. Well, again, I think now at this point, I think even past my technical delays, I've taken up your hour. If I guess maybe as a closing comment, I always like to leave it to the presenter. Was there anything else that you wanted to let us know before you sign off, or anything we can consider when playing our games?
No, I think about the experience that is being given to you, and think about what you are contributing to that experience, and stop and look at the running gnomes when you get the chance.
That's I was going to say that I think that's a wonderful way to leave it. I must thank Professor Marshall for coming in. Again, this was part of the series for the Extra Life fundraiser. This is for the BC Children's Hospital. And again, this is a thank you to donors. If you haven't donated already, please contribute before the end of the year. Professor Marshall did do this in order to help the charity, although we're definitely grateful for the fact that he shared his insight with us. But other than that, I will end the recording. And for those of you who are tuning in right now, now you just get to hear me live. And for Professor Marshall, I will send you the links when it's done.
Thank you very much, Norman. It's really nice talking with you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay.
All right. I hope you guys found that as interesting to listen to as I did in setting up and getting a chance to talk to Professor Marshall. I got some feedback that the audio was quite quiet, and I apologize for that. I think I said this at the beginning of the broadcast. I'm a little bit limited in terms of what my software can do, both in terms of recording, which it sounds fine in my headphones, but regarding broadcast, there's only so much that the third. I need to use a third-party program to uh, put the audio out as well. So I apologize that it was not as clear as I could be, and certainly I think Professor Marshall's ideas were interesting enough that they certainly deserve a much better presentation than I'm capable of giving out. But I thought that was tremendous of him to share his time and his insight. I really loved a lot of the stuff that he had to say in terms of how the rules of what we're playing sort of shape the experience, or maybe even just kicking against the boundaries influence that as well. One of the first things I thought of when he was sort of talking about these board games and either people subverting them for their own ends, or how a set of rules can lead to a particular experience, is the example of Monopoly. Monopoly, I think most people have heard this anecdote, but Monopoly tends to, or was originally intended to be a communication of the economic ideas, I believe, of Georgism. But basically, like the core of the game is still there, which is basically one person gets everything and everybody else is screwed. But where it used to be sort of this teaching tool that would tell you, this is how the world works and we need to change it, I think instead has become this great celebration that you too can be the guy who, grinds his friends to powder and gets to keep everything for himself or herself. So I think what Professor Marshall had to say has a lot of relevance to what we're doing, especially in terms of things like Twitch. My experience of playing these games, even when I'm not having a chance to talk to a professor about these ideas, um, I think my experience is very different when I get to talk with you guys during the games and get some feedback, or even just knowing that people will stop by and look at it. It's a fun one, and I really like the fact that you guys come in and share it with me. So we're at the hour mark. I'm going to take about a 3-minute break, and I'm probably going to do some of the stuff I should have gotten done during this afternoon and didn't. So I'm just going to hold it on this. Actually, I should probably go back to the main screen so I can adjust the volume settings again and give you guys some music to listen to. I'll ask a quick moment of your time. I did say this a couple of times in the broadcast as well, but it's really important to reiterate this stuff. This is part of the Extra Life 24-hour charity fundraiser. The 24-hour broadcast is done. It was already sent onto YouTube if you're interested in seeing it. System Chalk is the name for that as well. But we're really close to $500 on the fundraiser. these professors agreed to help me out with giving you guys something that you'd indicated some interest in. I'm interested in doing this too, so I've had a lot of fun doing that. But I think because they're so generous in sharing their time, the hope is to either get people who are on the fence about donating, or maybe some people who haven't seen the stream before but are interested in the topics. Basically, give another motivation to try and solicit some kind of a donation. The original recommended amount was $24, one for each hour of the broadcast. But at this point here, any contribution helps, even $1. It's a time of year where I know a lot of people are going to be making requests of you for charitable giving or something like that. But the BC Children's Hospital is something that is local for me. It's something I've personally benefited from. I have been a patient there. I know people who have benefited from it in a much greater way than I have. People who've had very serious issues that have been dealt with. It's one of those things that is just an unambiguously good cause, and so if you haven't already contributed, I hope you guys would consider it. But with that in mind, I'm going to get up, stretch, take care of myself, and I hope you guys do the same, and we'll be back in a few minutes to finish off Civilization. Thanks. Well, it would appear the game, I don't know if the game audio cut out for me or if it's just not clear on my end as well. I'm just going to run a test. All right, so my audio has actually completely cut out for myself. So what I think I will do, I think this is actually a nice way to highlight the video as well. So I'm going to end the broadcast and then I'm just going to start it up again so I can give it a different title and not sell it as being a civilization with a prof anymore. And then we'll be back to finish it. I'll take my break during that time. So the broadcast will go off. I will be coming back very shortly from that. But the break's going to be a slightly extended one just because I'm going to set up the broadcast and then I'll go off and do my stuff. So signing off for a minute. Be back in a second.